So Twister's remake comes out, and everybody pulls a Walter Sobchak.
The whole world gone crazy! Am I the only one around here who gives a shit about the rules?
I mean, it really says a lot about the state of media literacy when you have one side screaming, why is there no message about climate change? While the other is going, thank fuck there's no message about climate change. When, I mean, there's clearly a message about climate change. The director of the Twister remake came out recently and said that he thinks movies aren't meant to be message-oriented and that he didn't want to create the feeling that he was preaching a message, and that's why the remake doesn't have the words climate change a single time during its nearly 2-hour runtime. And I think that given that there totally is a message, it's just not super in your face the way messages in movies have been for the past few years, it's safe to say that what Lee Isaac Chung is referring to is more like overt propaganda rather than something like Shawshank saying, criminals are people too. Or at the very least, that there are certain movies that do deserve to make some sort of commentary about the state of the world, whereas others, like turn your brain off popcorn summer blockbusters, aka Twisters, don't. So let's talk propaganda. Ever since people realized that, other people will go and sit and watch movies, a lot of the time there have been certain messages embedded within those movies. I mean, duh, right? The most famous example, of course, is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which was a propaganda film produced by the Nazi Party in 1935. But while that might be one of the most famous, it wasn't the first by any means. That honor actually goes to a series of short silent films that were made during the Spanish-American War in 1898. That's literally just 3 years after the Lumiere brothers made the first commercial screenings of films in 1895, widely considered the beginning of just film in general. Seriously, think about that. It only took 3 years for governments to use a totally new medium to spread their messages. That's wild. Not surprising, but just wild. At this point, I think it's important to do a bit of a vocab check. Propaganda on its own has an extremely negative connotation, which wasn't always the case. The UK's Ministry of Information, which existed during the First and Second World Wars, for example, had a department called the Propaganda Bureau. Not at all something we'd see today. The negative stuff pretty much comes from both Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany using a lot of propaganda during and after the war, and most propaganda offices in governments today are called stuff like public relations or public information offices. The shit that George Carlin would have definitely had a problem with.
I'm telling you, some of this language makes me want to vomit. Well, maybe not vomit. Makes me want to engage in an involuntary personal protein spill.
But again, not all propaganda is bad by definition. As an example, Smokey the Bear, the only you can prevent wildfires guy, is a form of government-backed propaganda. It's also super important to know that propaganda doesn't have to be created or backed by government in order to be propaganda. The idea of a carbon footprint, for example, was created by good old BP in 2004 as a way of blaming consumers for their use of petrol products and shifting the blame away from themselves. It's not our fault we're fucking up the planet, you guys keep buying this shit. Nowadays, propaganda has become more at least government-backed propaganda. It's kind of an open secret that the US military is one of the biggest Hollywood financial backers, and it's also not exactly a coincidence that most films depict the US military as generally good and or extremely cool. Top Gun is probably the most famous example of a movie that was meant to do two things, that is, help Navy recruitment, like the Navy had recruitment booths in some theaters when the movie was screening and everything. And there's a popular claim that says enlistment went up something like 500% when Top Gun came out, when the reality is more like 8. It's not that much, but it's still a pretty significant uptick. The other thing was to help change public perception of the US military following the PR shit show that was the Vietnam War. So I think it's pretty interesting that people tend to have a serious aversion to anything that's propaganda nowadays, and yet doesn't really matter how egregious Top Gun is about its pro-military messaging, most people still fucking love that movie. I personally think that the entertainment value of the movie itself, coupled with the fact that it's just subtle enough not to have Maverick look at the screen and go, "Hey, enlist, aren't planes fun?" Ow! is enough so that its politics can be largely ignored. And this is the parallel that I want to draw with Twisters. Not that Twisters is a government-backed propaganda film, but that the messages and politics within, purposeful or not, I'll get into that, are subtle enough that most people can either ignore them or straight up don't even notice at all. So before I get into why Twisters doesn't feel woke, even though it actually very much is, let's talk about how it works as a remake. The original Twisters from 1996 is one of the 90s highest grossing films, making nearly $500 million at the box office. It's also my dad's favorite movie.
Come on.
So I watched it a lot growing up, and as a result, I fucking love it too, man. It's awesome. Dusty, Rabbit, and the rest of the group is as iconic as the flying cows, the action is dumb, and there are moments that are just absolutely ridiculous.
Oh my god! I think we're going in!
But they're purposefully ridiculous and entertaining, and I love this movie for it. The love triangle is really well made, with Bill clearly jumping into a marriage he's not ready for, and the sexual tension between him and Joe is as intense as the F5 at the end, you know, like barely holding on by a tiny leather belt.
Hold on!
And I personally think the remake does a pretty great job of continuing with the spirit of the original. The ridiculousness of going through a house is mirrored in stuff like shooting fireworks through a tornado. You have all the big boom set pieces, the focus on science, and just enough references to the original for them to be catchable, but not overtly obvious nostalgia bait the way Jurassic World, to give an example, handled the night vision goggles. Now, a lot of modern day remakes of old movies have a tendency to go back and try and improve on certain aspects of their originals. This is absolutely foreshadowing for a point I'll be making in the future, but Disney, for example, has been pretty goddamn ham-fisted about doing the same with their princesses. Twisters, on the other hand, takes one of the original's weakest points, the antagonist, and actually builds on it. The original Twister uses the character of Jonas as the main rival for our ragtag group of storm chasers. Unfortunately for Jonas, he doesn't really do much as an antagonist.
Buddy! Loser! Move on!
He steals Bill and Joe's original idea for Dorothy in order to create Dot 3, and then promptly gets sucked into a tornado and blows up. He doesn't really appear throughout most of the movie, and the whole "he's in it for the money, not the science" thing is, it's pretty silly and weak. It's hard to think of a more 90s motivation, but it's still pretty weak. I can definitely see an argument being made for removing Jonas altogether and just adding more tornado stuff, but at the same time, Jonas actually serves a pretty necessary function as an extra motivation for our characters. See, a lot of people think of Twister as a disaster movie, but I think that there is a pretty big difference between this and other movies within the same genre. Like, if you take The World After Tomorrow or even 2012, the motivation for the characters in those movies is pretty simple. It's basically just survival. They are people who are stuck in a situation that they cannot control, and so there really is no need for them to have a reason to do what they are doing. Wanting to survive is mostly enough. Twister, however, is completely different in that respect because our main characters are putting themselves into these extreme situations of their own accord, and as such need clear-cut motivations for doing so. The original does a great job of defining this for Joe in particular by showing her dad being killed by an F5 tornado at the beginning of the movie. And there's a wonderful moment where she's desperately trying to pick up Dorothy's sensors and she basically breaks down because of it. She's trying to save people from what she experienced as a child and has basically become completely obsessed with Twisters. We see this obsession not just here, but also when she and Bill are under that bridge thing. Beautifully done is also the fact that this motivation is exactly the thing that caused her and Bill to break up in the first place. There are multiple moments throughout the movie where it's hinted that Joe refused to let go of her work in order to settle down, get married, and start a family with Bill. It's actually a really complex relationship, and the character building here is really fucking good. Then we have Bill. Bill's motivation is a little less clear-cut. He's obviously not as tornado-obsessed as Joe, but he still really cares about the science and is so enamored with the adrenaline, the chase, and the data that he frequently forgets that he's putting his new fiancée in some seriously traumatizing situations. As far as motivation goes, there really isn't much there though. Like, we can see him acting this way, but why does he? The movie doesn't really get into this too much except for, well, insert Jonas. See, this is the function that Jonas serves. He's purely there to give Bill an easily digestible motivation. Bill's idea for Dorothy was copied by Jonas, so if Bill doesn't go out and chase Twisters, a lot of his work is going to be stolen. It's a far more simple thing for the audience to understand, and it's not something that requires a lot of screen time the way that exploring Bill's probably more complex underlying reasons for doing what he does would. As such, the movie can focus mostly on Joe, while also devoting time to Bill through Jonas, thus creating two very well fleshed out characters with incredible efficiency. It's not a coincidence that Joe isn't as bothered by Jonas as Bill.
You ought to get a leash on.
It's not my problem, it's yours.
Just like it's not a coincidence that Bill isn't as emotionally invested in the Twisters as Joe. Bill's antagonist is Jonas. Joe's antagonists are the Twisters. And if you notice, they each hold each other back whenever they let their emotions get the better of them while facing their respective rivals. It's honestly pretty fucking genius. But again, Jonas is still pretty weak as an antagonist, and while being Bill's foil is good for the audience to understand one of our protagonist's surface level motivations, there is still a lot that could have been done to make the entire thing better. I really like what the Twisters remake did with the bad team. The inclusion of Marshall Riggs as the corporate overlord profiteering from Stormpar's research by buying tornado-ravaged land at extremely low prices and reselling for insane amounts is a huge improvement over "but my research," in my opinion. But that's about it for improvements. Unfortunately, the movie decided that spending time pulling the old good team actually bad-a-roo was a good idea. And I could go on a super long tangent explaining why their decision to do this actually kind of weakens the rest of the film, but I won't because it doesn't really make sense to do within the context of this video in particular. Suffice it to say that I think having Tyler and Javi work together from the beginning to stop Stormpar would have been a greater motivation for Kate to come back to work and would have given us more time to spend with the other YouTubers slash quirky characters the way we did with Dusty and Rabbit in the original.
The suck zone.
But let's come back to Marshall Riggs. So one of the things that people seem to have written countless articles and blog posts about is the fact that the film constantly mentions that times are changing, that storms are getting worse and becoming more frequent, but that it also kind of goes out of its way to never mention the reason why, i.e. climate change. I think most people have misinterpreted this as the film doing everything it can to pander to people who don't believe that climate change is real, but I don't really know if I agree with this. It's true that it's extremely likely that the studio didn't want to have that word mentioned given the film's setting and the fact that climate change denial is far more common in Middle America, but at the same time, not mentioning the cause of these issues at all is exactly the way you get people who don't believe in said cause to watch a film where the effects of it are very clearly laid out. Like take the YouTube channel Climate Town, for example. Personally, I think Raleigh Williams puts out some of the most informative and important content with regards to climate change, and I think everybody should watch it if they get the chance. But the overwhelming likelihood, unfortunately, is that the vast majority of people watching those videos are people who already agree with him. What Twisters does instead is take the buzzwords out. You might not believe that climate change is real, but you sure as shit know for a fact that there are people out there in the world right now who, like Marshall Riggs, are absolutely taking advantage of other people's misfortune. Not mentioning the buzzword is, in this case, the best way to get as many people watching and thinking about how this stuff might affect them without striking a weird political nerve. And honestly, I don't know if the writers and director did this on purpose. It's perfectly possible that they didn't and they just wrote a movie where they were honestly trying to explore how people are affected by these natural disasters with just a tiny bit more depth than the original movie. After all, we can't forget that the original purpose of this film in particular is to entertain. We're talking about a blockbuster, a turn your brain off popcorn flick, right? Like not, I don't know, 1984 or Brave New World. Speaking of propaganda-laden shit, let's talk recent Disney movies. And by shit, I don't mean shit. I just mean Disney. If you really want a far more in-depth analysis of pretty much everything I'm about to say, go watch pretty much every single video on Lindsay Ellis's channel, particularly a video called Woke Disney. And this is going to be a pretty general overview of what the Disney company has been doing these last few years, but basically they've just been very hard at work trying to undo certain valid criticisms that modern audiences have made about their past films, particularly in the princess department. What I'm talking about is the whole #girlboss thing that we've been getting for a while now. The stereotype for your classic Disney princess, whether that stereotype is accurate or not, spoilers, it isn't really, is basically your run-of-the-mill damsel in distress who only cares about the guy she's going to potentially live happily ever after with. This is basically what the first Shrek movie was making fun of with Fiona, especially when we first meet her. She's ultra obsessed with true love, she puckers her lips when Shrek enters the room, all that fun stuff. Of course, afterwards, the movie subverts all the tropes and shows us a character who actually has quite a bit of depth and who can handle herself not just in a fight, but in general too. This is kind of what Disney was afraid of, and what they worked their asses off to basically overcorrect. I think a lot of people have at some point kind of rolled their eyes or groaned after one of Disney's recent #girlboss moments, and I think the reason why is that the more egregious of them kind of have zero effect on the plot. To give an example, Belle in the Beauty and the Beast remake is shown as being an inventor and super smart, but the fact that she's capable of inventing a washing machine at the beginning of the movie isn't used in any way to help the Beast or the castle staff with their curse situation, or even when the villagers are attacking. It's literally just a character trait that's been put there because we're woke now. And look, Disney's whole corporate wokeness thing is absolutely a form of propaganda. It's just not trying to convince you of what you think. Their main objective here isn't, hey, being a feminist is a good thing. It's, hey, we care about women. Buy our stuff. And this is kind of the thing that Lee Isaac Chung, director of Twisters, was renouncing when he said what he did about movies not needing to have messages. Because this sort of stuff, whether that's Belle inventing useless shit within the context of her movie, or Jasmine having a song about not wanting to be silenced, or fucking this shot from Avengers Endgame, it just doesn't help anybody. All it does is piss off the people who don't agree with it, making them even less likely to reconsider their beliefs, and only gives a vapid representation that doesn't really solve anything. But Twisters actually gets around this. I guess I might call it like a quiet feminist movie. It's just a movie where the female character is written to be strong but doesn't draw attention to itself the way Galadriel does in The Rings of Power. Like, I think the original Alien with Ellen Ripley, or more recently something like Annihilation with Natalie Portman. Because, well, let's take a look at Kate. Now, I don't really know about you, but I feel like this is a very feminist character. Kate goes through a lot in this movie. She's dealing with the loss of her friends, the guilt she feels over having potentially caused that loss, the rejection of her dream to tame Twisters, the fucking PTSD of having been stuck in one, and yet she's also really fucking strong. She works through her grief, works through her guilt, allows herself to trust another man to put her literally inside the thing that killed her friends, and in the end, it's her alone putting herself in danger to stop a literal force of nature. It's her story, her catharsis, her redemption arc. And yet, no one is talking about this movie in the context of feminism. Actually, quite the opposite. I watched a video by The Critical Drinker on this movie where he says that there is a refreshing lack of woke messaging in Twisters. And it's kind of funny because, well, it's almost the opposite. Like, this is a very feminist movie. I don't know, man. The same thing happened with Annihilation, where everyone was pining for films with female protagonists, but then no one even mentioned the fact that there was an action/horror movie made in 2018 that only features female protagonists. A small part of me feels that a lot of the silence comes out of the fact that many recent films with super woke surface level characters often make a point of having them kind of undermine other male characters. It's like General Holdo from Star Wars, just kind of being an asshat in general. I don't think anyone liked her. Twisters, on the other hand, does something totally different, where Tyler is relegated to minor character status, but is used as a foil for Kate instead of just being dismissed as an idiot adrenaline junkie. By being an idiot adrenaline junkie, he manages to help Kate get out of the funk she's in and encourages her to continue pursuing her experiments. His character basically helps prop her character up. It's one of the reasons why I think the whole rodeo moment where they're talking about Tyler's history works so well. Tyler's not just letting Kate into his world, but by doing so, he's also giving her an example to follow, giving her the keys, essentially laying the groundwork that will help her eventually overcome her own issues with her past. And I think this is great. The movie is comfortable and confident enough in Kate's femininity as a character that it doesn't have to knock down everyone around her to get her to stand out. People just see a strong woman actually being awesome, and I mean, what a coincidence that no one seems to have a problem with it. Again, this is, I think, very similar to the Top Gun thing I was talking about earlier. This is a movie about the effects of climate change from the perspective of a strong female character. On paper, saying it the way I just did, this thing should have been controversial. But by keeping the politics subtle and the action at the forefront, the movie basically avoids most of the criticism that could have been leveled against it, while at the same time thriving within its own political space and avoiding any accusations of being caps lock woke. So yeah, I don't know, it seems like people hate being preached to and that surface level changes meant to appease idiots with awful media literacy are annoying and unproductive in general. I guess that's my point. I don't know, all movies have some sort of bias. This was a fun movie and probably one of the better remakes. I still prefer the original. That's all I have for you. Go away.